On the morning of the 15th of September 1940, the late summer sun broke through scattered clouds over the English Channel. Across occupied France, ground crews at airfields stretching from Pas-de-Calais to the Cherbourg Peninsula were already warming the engines of hundreds of Heinkel 111s, Dornier 17s, and the twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s that would escort them. The Luftwaffe had been pounding Britain for months now, and today was meant to deliver the knockout blow. What those German air crews did not know, what nobody on either side could have fully anticipated, was that by sunset, the entire strategic calculus of the war would fundamentally change. The Battle of Britain had officially begun on the 10th of July 1940, when the Luftwaffe started attacking Channel convoys and coastal installations. By mid-August, the focus shifted to RAF airfields and the crucial sector stations that controlled fighter operations across southern England. The Germans called this phase Adlerangriff, or Eagle Attack, and its explicit purpose was simple: destroy Fighter Command so completely that the planned invasion of Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, could proceed without interference from the sky. Adolf Hitler had set a provisional invasion date of the 21st of September, which meant Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had precious few weeks to deliver air superiority over the Channel and the landing beaches. Throughout late August and early September, it genuinely appeared the Luftwaffe might succeed. RAF losses were mounting at an alarming rate. Between the 24th of August and the 6th of September alone, Fighter Command lost 295 aircraft, destroyed or damaged beyond repair, against 262 Luftwaffe planes. More critically, 103 British pilots were killed and 128 wounded during this same fortnight, losses that Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding's organisation could barely sustain. The sector stations at Biggin Hill, Kenley and Hornchurch had been repeatedly bombed, their operations rooms damaged, their communications disrupted. Park's 11 Group, which bore the brunt of defending London and the South East, was being ground down through sheer attrition. Then, on the 7th of September, everything changed. Whether by accident or design, historians still debate the precise catalyst, the Luftwaffe shifted its primary focus away from the airfields and toward London itself. This was the beginning of what Londoners would grimly call the Blitz. From a German perspective, the logic seemed sound. Bombing the capital would force Fighter Command to commit every available aircraft to its defence, allowing the Messerschmitt 109s to engage and destroy them in a single decisive air battle. It would also, Göring believed, break British civilian morale and pressure Churchill's government toward a negotiated peace. What this strategic shift actually accomplished was something entirely different. It gave Fighter Command's battered infrastructure a desperately needed reprieve. The sector stations that had been on the verge of collapse suddenly found themselves with time to repair damaged buildings, restore telephone lines, and reorganize their exhausted personnel. Fresh pilots arriving from operational training units could be properly integrated into squadrons rather than thrown immediately into combat. The radar chain, that invisible technological advantage the Germans never fully understood, continued functioning and improving its coordination with the fighter control system. By the 15th of September, Fighter Command was not the broken force Göring imagined it to be. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park had approximately 600 serviceable fighters at his disposal across 11 and 12 groups, with pilot strength actually recovering rather than declining. The big wing controversy between Park and Air Vice Marshal Trafford, Lee Mallory of 12 Group, remained unresolved, but operationally the system was working. The Dowding System, that integrated network of radar stations, observer corps posts, filter rooms and sector operations rooms, was feeding accurate information to controllers who could vector fighters precisely where they were needed. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging experienced aircrew at a rate that could not be sustained indefinitely. The bomber crews in particular were suffering tremendous psychological strain after weeks of facing determined opposition. Hermann Göring had made a catastrophic series of miscalculations throughout the summer of 1940, and by mid-September these errors were compounding into strategic disaster. The Reichsmarschall, who had personally assured Hitler that his Luftwaffe would bring Britain to its knees, consistently demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of air warfare and an inability to maintain coherent tactical priorities. The problems began with intelligence. German assessments of RAF strength were wildly optimistic, consistently underestimating both aircraft production and pilot availability. By early September, Luftwaffe intelligence was reporting that Fighter Command had been reduced to fewer than 200 serviceable aircraft, a figure that was catastrophically wrong. The actual number was closer to 700. This intelligence failure meant that every German tactical decision was built upon a foundation of fantasy rather than fact. Göring's leadership style made matters considerably worse. He interfered constantly with operational planning, often overruling experienced commanders like Field Marshal Albert Kesselring and Field Marshal Hugo Sperl, based on whims rather than military logic. When losses mounted, he blamed his fighter pilots for cowardice rather than examining the structural problems with his strategy. In one infamous incident on the 3rd of September, Göring summoned his fighter commanders to The Hague and publicly berated them for failing to protect the bombers adequately. When Major Adolf Galland, one of Germany's leading aces, was asked what he needed to win the battle, he reportedly replied that he would like an outfit of Spitfires. The comment captured the frustration felt throughout the fighter force. The decision to switch from attacking airfields to bombing London was perhaps Göring's most consequential error. The raids on sector stations had been genuinely effective. Biggin Hill had been bombed 6 times in 3 days during late August, with its operations room destroyed and emergency facilities barely functioning. Kenley, Hornchurch and North Weald had all suffered significant damage. Had this pressure been maintained for another fortnight, the consequences for Fighter Command could have been severe. Instead, the shift to London on the 7th of September allowed these vital installations to recover. The tactical employment of fighters represented another fundamental problem. The Messerschmitt 109 was an excellent aircraft, arguably superior to the Hurricane and roughly equal to the Spitfire in combat performance. However, its limited fuel capacity meant it could spend only 20 to 30 minutes over England before being forced to turn back. Göring's insistence on close escort tactics, keeping fighters tied directly to the slower bomber formations, negated much of the 109's performance advantage and frustrated pilots who knew they could be more effective hunting freely. The bomber force itself was ill-suited for the strategic campaign it was being asked to conduct. The Heinkel 111, Dornier 17 and Junkers 88 were all medium bombers designed for tactical support of ground operations, not for sustained strategic bombing against a well-defended nation. They lacked the range, bomb capacity and defensive armament that true strategic bombing required. The Luftwaffe had no equivalent to the heavy 4-engine bombers that the RAF and United States Army Air Forces would later employ. This meant that even when German bombers reached their targets, the damage they inflicted was never quite sufficient to be decisive. By the 15th of September, Luftwaffe morale was deteriorating noticeably. Bomber crews had been flying missions over England for over 2 months, watching friends shot down day after day. The promised destruction of Fighter Command had manifestly not occurred. Every mission seemed to meet the same determined opposition. Replacement crews arriving from training units lacked the experience of those they were replacing, while surviving veterans grew increasingly fatalistic about their chances of completing their tours. Göring remained publicly confident, assuring Hitler that one more massive blow would finally shatter British resistance. The attacks planned for the 15th of September would be that blow, the largest daylight raids since the campaign began. While Göring convinced himself that Fighter Command was on the verge of collapse, the reality across southern England told an entirely different story. The breathing space provided by the shift to London bombing had allowed Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and Air Vice Marshal Keith Park to reconstitute their forces with remarkable speed. By the second week of September, the RAF was stronger than German intelligence believed possible. British aircraft production was the foundation of this recovery. Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production appointed by Churchill in May 1940, had transformed the nation's manufacturing capacity through a combination of ruthless energy, improvisation, and sheer willpower. Factories were working around the clock. Damaged aircraft were being repaired and returned to service with extraordinary efficiency. The civilian repair organisation, often overlooked in accounts of the battle, was recovering crashed fighters from fields across southern England and rebuilding them. During September 1940, British factories produced 467 fighters, while the civilian repair organisation returned another 163 repaired aircraft to service. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was producing approximately 200 single-engine fighters monthly. Pilot availability had also improved significantly. The crisis of late August, when Fighter Command was losing pilots faster than replacements could be trained, had eased. Volunteers from the Fleet Air Arm and Bomber Command were transferring to fighters. Pilots from occupied European nations, Poles, Czechs, Belgians, and French, were forming their own squadrons and proving themselves exceptionally effective. The Polish 303 Squadron would claim the highest number of victories of any squadron during the battle, their pilots motivated by a burning desire to strike back at the enemy that had destroyed their homeland. The radar network remained Fighter Command's invisible advantage. The chain home stations along the coast could detect incoming formations while they were still assembling over France, providing crucial early warning that allowed controllers to position fighters advantageously. The Germans had attacked radar stations during August, but the damage was quickly repaired, and the attacks were not sustained. German intelligence never fully appreciated how central radar was to British defensive effectiveness, viewing the tall transmitter masts as merely one element among many, rather than the linchpin of the entire system. The Dowding System that integrated radar with fighter control had been refined through months of combat experience. Information flowed from radar stations to filter rooms, where it was processed and assessed, then to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory, and finally to the group and sector operations rooms that actually directed the squadrons. Controllers had learned to interpret German intentions, to distinguish feints from main attacks, and to position their fighters for maximum advantage. The system was not perfect. There were still coordination problems and communication failures, but it was functioning far more effectively than the Germans understood. Park's tactical approach had also evolved. He had learned that meeting the enemy over the Channel was wasteful, as damaged British aircraft would be lost to the sea, along with their pilots. Instead, he now positioned his squadrons to intercept after the German formations had crossed the coast, often allowing the first wave of escorts to expend their limited fuel before committing his main force. He rotated squadrons to distribute fatigue more evenly and ensured that fresh pilots flew alongside experienced veterans who could guide them through their first combats. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Operation Sea Lion could proceed. German commanders believed one more maximum effort would finally break British resistance. British commanders knew their forces were ready to meet whatever came. On the night of the 14th of September, both sides prepared for what the morning would bring. The morning of the 15th of September dawned clear over southern England, with scattered clouds at between 2,000 and 3,000 feet and excellent visibility above. At Bentley Priory, the headquarters of Fighter Command in Stanmore, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters began their shifts, knowing that good weather likely meant heavy attacks. They were not wrong. German formations began assembling over the Pas-de-Calais around 11 o'clock. The radar stations at Dover, Rye and Pevensey detected the build-up almost immediately, their cathode ray screens showing the familiar patterns of aircraft circling as they gained altitude and formed up. By 11:30, the filter room at Bentley Priory had identified a massive formation crossing the channel, approximately 100 bombers escorted by similar numbers of fighters, their course pointed directly at London. Keith Park, commanding 11 Group from his underground operations room at Uxbridge, began scrambling squadrons immediately. Unlike previous occasions when he had committed fighters piecemeal, Park intended to meet this attack with overwhelming force. 6 squadrons were airborne by 11:45, with more following as the scale of the raid became apparent. Park also requested assistance from 12 Group to the north, asking Lee Mallory to position his big wing over London to catch any bombers that penetrated the initial defence line. Prime Minister Winston Churchill had chosen this particular Sunday to visit 11 Group headquarters at Uxbridge. He descended into the underground operations room with his wife Clementine and watched as the drama unfolded on the plotting table below. The sector clock on the wall ticked through its coloured segments, showing how current the information was. Squadron markers moved across the map as controllers vectored fighters toward the approaching threat. The German formation crossed the coast near Dungeness shortly after midday. It consisted primarily of Dornier 17s from Kampfgeschwader 76, escorted by Messerschmitt 109s from various fighter units. The bombers flew in tight defensive boxes, their crews scanning the sky for the first sign of British fighters. They did not have long to wait. Spitfires from 72 Squadron made first contact at approximately 10 minutes past 12, diving through the escort screen to attack the bombers head-on. The Messerschmitts responded immediately, and within moments, the sky over Kent was filled with wheeling, turning aircraft. More squadrons joined the battle in rapid succession. Hurricanes from 229 and 303 squadrons, Spitfires from 66 and 92. The carefully ordered German formation began to fragment under sustained attack. The bombers pressed on toward London, but their cohesion was breaking down. Individual aircraft, damaged or separated from their units, turned back toward the coast. Others jettisoned their bombs over the Kent countryside rather than press through the fighter gauntlet. Those that reached the outskirts of London found more squadrons waiting. 12 Group's big wing, comprising 5 squadrons from Duxford, descended on the raiders from above. The Duxford wing, led by squadron leader Douglas Bader of 242 Squadron, caught the German formation over South London at approximately 12:30. Bader had been advocating for massed fighter formations throughout the battle, and now his theory was put into practice. The psychological impact of 60 fighters appearing simultaneously proved considerable. German bomber crews, already shaken by the running battle across Kent, watched with dismay as yet more Hurricanes and Spitfires bore down on them. Bombs fell across London, hitting railway lines, residential areas, and the Victoria railway station, but the attack was scattered and inaccurate. By 1 o'clock, the surviving bombers were heading back toward France, harried every mile by pursuing fighters. The morning wave had failed to deliver its knockout blow. The German commanders had anticipated losses during the morning attack, but they remained committed to their plan. A second, even larger wave would follow in the afternoon, catching the British fighters on the ground as they refueled and rearmed. This calculation proved fatally flawed. Fighter Command's ground crews worked with extraordinary speed during the early afternoon, turning aircraft around in times that German planners had not thought possible. By 1:30, most of the morning's squadrons were ready to fight again. The second wave began crossing the Channel shortly after 2 o'clock. This formation was substantially larger than the morning attack, approximately 114 Dornier 17s and Heinkel 111s from multiple Kampfgeschwader, escorted by 361 fighters. The bombers came in 3 distinct groups, targeting the London docks and industrial areas along the Thames. German commanders hoped that dispersing the attack would stretch British defences to breaking point. Radar detected the build-up just as it had done in the morning. Park scrambled every available squadron, eventually committing 31 squadrons, totaling over 300 fighters. This time there would be no piecemeal response. The British intended to meet the Germans with maximum force from the outset. Churchill, still present at Uxbridge, watched the squadron markers on the plotting table move toward the enemy tracks. At one point he turned to Park and asked what reserves remained. Park's reply was blunt. There were none. Every available fighter was either airborne or scrambling. The battle would be won or lost with what they had committed. The two forces met over the Kent and Surrey countryside in what became the largest air battle of the entire campaign. The sky between Canterbury and London transformed into a swirling, three-dimensional arena of combat. Fighters and bombers filled the air at altitudes from 15,000 to 30,000 feet. Contrails streaked across the blue. Parachutes blossomed as pilots abandoned stricken aircraft. Burning machines fell trailing smoke toward the fields below. Squadron after squadron tore into the German formations. The Polish 303 Squadron claimed 16 victories during the afternoon engagement alone, their pilots attacking with an aggression that startled even their British comrades. Sergeant Josef František, a Czech pilot flying with the Poles, destroyed 2 aircraft, adding to his growing tally. Squadron leader Brian Lane led 19 Squadron into the Heinkels with devastating effect. Over Maidstone, over Sevenoaks, over the suburbs of South London, the pattern repeated. Hurricanes attacking the bombers, while Spitfires engaged the escorts. The Messerschmitt won. 09s faced an impossible situation. Their fuel limitations meant they could not remain over England indefinitely, yet withdrawing left the bombers defenceless. Many German fighters turned for home with substantial fuel remaining, their pilots recognizing they could not protect their charges and survive. Others stayed too long and were forced to ditch in the Channel when their tanks ran dry. The bomber formations disintegrated under the sustained assault. Aircraft fell in clusters over Kent and Sussex. Others, badly damaged, struggled back toward the French coast on failing engines. The streets of London received bombs, but the attack was even more scattered than the morning's effort. Civilians emerged from shelters to see vapour trails crisscrossing the sky and parachutes descending over the rooftops. Several German aircrew came down in suburban gardens to be promptly captured by air raid wardens, police constables, and in some cases, indignant housewives armed with kitchen implements. By 4 o'clock, the second wave had broken completely. The survivors limped back to France, leaving behind dozens of wrecked aircraft scattered across southern England. The Luftwaffe had suffered a defeat from which it would not recover. The accounting of the 15th of September began even before the last aircraft had landed. British claims, compiled from pilot reports submitted in the immediate aftermath of combat, totaled 185 German aircraft destroyed. This figure was announced triumphantly by the Air Ministry and broadcast across the nation and the world. Church bells rang in villages throughout southern England. Newspapers proclaimed a decisive victory. The date was quickly designated Battle of Britain Day, a title it retains to this day. The actual German losses, established through post-war analysis of Luftwaffe records, were significantly lower but nonetheless devastating. 60 aircraft were confirmed destroyed, 26 bombers and 34 fighters. A further 20 aircraft returned to France so badly damaged they were written off. Approximately 60 aircrew were killed, with a similar number captured. These losses represented the highest single-day toll the Luftwaffe had suffered since the costly attacks on airfields during mid-August. The discrepancy between British claims and actual German losses requires explanation rather than criticism. Fighter combat in 1940 was extraordinarily confusing. Pilots engaged targets at high speed, often seeing only brief glimpses of enemy aircraft before maneuvering away. Multiple pilots frequently attacked the same target, each believing they had scored the decisive hit. Bombers trailing smoke were recorded as destroyed when some actually made it back to France. There was no deliberate exaggeration, simply the inevitable fog of war compounded by the genuine difficulty of assessing results during swirling dogfights. For the Luftwaffe, the disparity mattered little. 60 aircraft destroyed in a single day, more than an entire Gruppe, was unsustainable regardless of British propaganda claims. The psychological impact on German aircrew proved equally significant. Bomber crews had been assured repeatedly that fighter command was finished, that resistance would be negligible, that one more effort would secure victory. Instead, they had encountered the fiercest opposition of the entire campaign. The sky had been thick with Spitfires and Hurricanes. Friends had died. Confidence in their commanders' assessments collapsed. Göring's reaction demonstrated the bankruptcy of German strategic leadership. Rather than acknowledging the fundamental problems with his campaign, he blamed subordinates and demanded greater effort. His credibility with Hitler, already diminished by the summer's failures, suffered further damage. The Luftwaffe had been given every opportunity to deliver the air superiority necessary for invasion, and it had manifestly failed. The RAF's claims, whatever their accuracy, served a crucial propaganda purpose. Britain needed a clear victory to maintain civilian morale and international credibility. The announcement of 185 German aircraft destroyed provided exactly that. American newspapers reported the battle prominently, reinforcing the impression that Britain could withstand German assault. This perception influenced American public opinion during a presidential election year, supporting Roosevelt's policy of providing increasing aid to Britain. Within Fighter Command, the mood was one of exhausted satisfaction rather than triumphalism. Pilots and ground crew alike knew the battle was not over. The Luftwaffe would return. But something had shifted. The sense that each day might bring final defeat. That the margin between survival and catastrophe was measured in single aircraft and individual pilots had begun to lift. Squadron diaries from the following days record improved morale, a growing confidence that the worst had passed. The Germans, conversely, faced an uncomfortable truth. Despite weeks of sustained effort, despite thousands of sorties, despite considerable losses, Fighter Command remained undefeated and apparently undiminished. The assumptions underlying Operation Sea Lion were collapsing. The 15th of September had not destroyed British air defence. It had demonstrated its resilience. 2 days after the disaster over London, Adolf Hitler convened a meeting with his senior military commanders in Berlin. The agenda was Operation Sea Lion, but the discussion quickly became a post-mortem on Luftwaffe failure. The original invasion date of the 21st of September was now impossible. The necessary air superiority had not been achieved, and the autumn weather window was closing rapidly. On the 17th of September 1940, Hitler formally postponed Sea Lion indefinitely. The decision was presented as a temporary delay rather than cancellation. Hitler maintained the fiction that invasion remained possible, ordering preparations to continue, and the invasion fleet to remain assembled in Channel ports. This served two purposes. It kept pressure on Britain and preserved German prestige. But the operational reality was clear to everyone present. The amphibious assault on England would not happen in 1940, and likely would not happen at all. The consequences rippled through German strategic planning. Hitler's attention began shifting eastward toward the Soviet Union. Planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, had commenced even before the Battle of Britain concluded, and the failure to knock Britain out of the war accelerated this pivot. Hitler convinced himself that defeating the Soviet Union would eliminate Britain's last potential continental ally, forcing Churchill to negotiate. This catastrophic miscalculation would ultimately destroy the Third Reich, but in September 1940 it represented Germany's chosen path forward. For the Luftwaffe, the immediate change was tactical. Daylight bombing raids against Britain continued sporadically through late September and October, but the massive formations that had characterized the summer campaign were abandoned. Losses during daylight simply could not be sustained. Instead, Göring pivoted to night bombing, the strategy that would define the Blitz through the winter of 1940 and into 1941. Night operations offered significant advantages for the attackers. British night fighter capability in 1940 was primitive. Radar-equipped Blenheims and Beaufighters were few in number and still developing effective tactics. Anti-aircraft fire, while psychologically reassuring for civilians below, was largely ineffective against high-altitude bombers in darkness. The Luftwaffe could operate over Britain with relative impunity during nighttime hours, striking industrial targets and city centres with minimal losses. The shift to night bombing represented an acknowledgement of defeat in the daylight battle. German doctrine had emphasized precision attacks against military and industrial targets, which required visual bombing in daylight conditions. Night bombing was inherently less accurate, spreading destruction across wider areas but reducing the impact on specific strategic targets. The distinction between military and civilian targets blurred in darkness, transforming the campaign into one of generalized terror against the British population. London bore the heaviest burden during the subsequent months. From the 7th of September 1940 until the 11th of May 1941, the capital was bombed on 76 consecutive nights, with only one exception due to weather. Other cities suffered terribly: Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Plymouth, Bristol, Southampton. The civilian death toll mounted into the tens of thousands, but the strategic purpose of the campaign, breaking British morale or compelling negotiation, was never achieved. Fighter Command had won the daylight battle, but the war continued. The night blitz tested British endurance in different ways, demanding resilience from civilians rather than pilots. Yet the fundamental achievement of the 15th of September remained. The invasion threat had been defeated. Britain would remain in the war as a base for eventual liberation of occupied Europe. The Royal Air Force had denied Germany the quick victory Hitler needed, buying time for American industrial power to mobilize and for the tide to eventually turn. The 15th of September 1940 occupies a singular place in British national memory, commemorated annually as Battle of Britain Day. This is not mere sentimentality. The strategic consequences of that single afternoon's fighting shaped the remainder of the Second World War and, by extension, the post-war world that emerged from it. Had Fighter Command been defeated, the invasion of Britain would have become feasible. Whether Operation Sea Lion would have succeeded remains debated among historians. The Royal Navy still posed a formidable threat to any cross-channel assault, and German amphibious capability was improvised rather than purpose-built. But the possibility itself was sufficient to alter the war's trajectory. An invaded or neutralized Britain would have deprived the Allied cause of its unsinkable aircraft carrier, the base from which strategic bombing of Germany and eventually the liberation of Western Europe would be launched. The American dimension proved equally significant. In September 1940, the United States remained officially neutral, though President Roosevelt was actively seeking ways to support Britain within the constraints of domestic politics. The Battle of Britain demonstrated that American aid would not be wasted on a nation about to collapse. British resilience encouraged Roosevelt to pursue Lend-Lease, approved by Congress in March 1941, which provided essential materiel to sustain the British war effort. American perceptions of British determination, shaped substantially by the summer's air battles, influenced these critical decisions. For the Royal Air Force, the battle established a mythology that endures to this day. Churchill's famous tribute, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," captured the public imagination and elevated Fighter Command's pilots to legendary status. The few became symbols of national resistance, their youth and sacrifice memorialized in countless books, films, and monuments. This mythology, while sometimes obscuring the contributions of ground crew, controllers, and the broader support network, served an essential purpose in sustaining British morale through the darker years that followed. The human cost demands acknowledgement. Fighter Command lost 544 pilots, killed during the official Battle of Britain period from the 10th of July to the 31st of October 1940. Many more were wounded, some grievously. The average age of these pilots was barely 20. They came from across Britain and the Commonwealth, from occupied Europe, from neutral nations that nonetheless produced volunteers willing to fight. Their sacrifice purchased time for American industry to mobilize, time for the Soviet Union to enter the war, time for the tide to turn. The Luftwaffe's failure over Britain exposed fundamental weaknesses in German strategic thinking. The assumption that air power alone could compel a determined nation to surrender proved false. The inability to accurately assess enemy strength led to disastrously optimistic planning. The lack of a genuine heavy bomber force limited what air assault could achieve. These lessons, dearly purchased over English skies, would be reinforced as the war continued, and strategic bombing campaigns on both sides demonstrated the difficulty of breaking national will from the air. The 60th aircraft that fell on the 15th of September 1940, whichever specific machine it was, represented far more than a single loss. It represented the moment when the Luftwaffe's daylight campaign became unsustainable, when the invasion threat effectively ended, when Britain's continued resistance was assured. The young men who flew that day, in their Spitfires and Hurricanes, their Messerschmitts and Dornier, could not have known the full significance of their actions. History would judge, and history judged the 15th of September as the day the tide turned. That is why the Luftwaffe stopped their daylight raids. They simply could not afford another day like this one.